Hello, all farmers and people that are working with farmers in Cyprus. I'm very happy, but also somewhat unhappy to speak to you today because I know you're going through some severe struggles with foot and mouth disease. I've been working with POA and many of your farmers over the last few years, and I've come to love Cyprus. And I also therefore know quite some about your situation and your farming situations. But of course, right now, you are in a very special situation. And I, as a veterinarian from Sweden that are working with preventing animal diseases and optimizing health, I want to reach out and help you with how to help you best get rid of this foot and mouth disease. I've been working with biosecurity and eradication of animal diseases across Europe and even in the Middle East. And I have some experience with what the best strategy is. Unfortunately, it's not an easy strategy. But first of all, I'd like to help you a bit about knowing a bit what foot and mouth disease really is and how you can detect it and understand it in order to best fight it. It's like they always say, you have to know your enemy. So foot and mouth disease is really a virus. It belongs to a group called the aftoviruses. And it's a really small virus, like an RNA virus, a bit like small like the coronavirus. But it's one of those that only affects cloven-hooved animals, sheep, goats, camels, dairy cows, pigs, and so on. It does not affect humans, so it's not a problem for humans. But it is one of the most threatened and dangerous diseases for animals across the globe. So it was one of the first diseases that the OIE started to regulate and impose worldwide trade restrictions for. So from the 1950s, we have what they call the Global Foot and Mouth Disease Control Strategy because it has such a severe negative impact on animal health. And not only animal health, it becomes food security and becomes national economy. So therefore, this is not a new disease at all. It has been around for very many decades, even centuries. So these official global and national control programs are tightly regulated, and you can read up a lot about those in the WHO websites. You can see the link there on the bottom. And it really, what they realized was most important is that the prevention of foot and mouth disease depends on the early detection and warning system. So you detect it early on, and that once you find it, you can immediately take actions to control it. As I mentioned, was the first disease that the WHO enlisted official list of disease-free members because they realized it's so valuable to not have this in your country. We're going to set up systems so that countries that are free can stay free. In these free countries, if you have an outbreak, then you can then get systems where you temporarily get a suspension from the free status so that you can eradicate this disease where it's found, possibly make some small ring vaccination to prevent the spread in order to then ultimately get back your free status. Now, as you know, there are also countries where they are vaccinating continuously. And these can be called free, but they're not really free because you can never really get rid of foot and mouth disease by vaccinating. You can most likely limit the negative consequences. So as you know, Cyprus has lost their free status due to this outbreak. Now, the foot and mouth disease, you may think, well, it's really just a small virus that most animals don't die and it doesn't affect humans. What's the big deal? It has such a huge impact on world animal food production. And as you know, we people are dependent on livestock. It reduces the herd fertility, it leads to less efficient herd structures, and really leads to high production losses. And this also ultimately affects food security. And they've seen in programs where they have FMD and they have control program, these management costs are huge. And they have to keep working to prevent it because if they do nothing, it's going to cost them too much. And countries that have ultimately been declared free of foot-and-mouth disease, they also have to, at time to time, invest huge amount of money to eradicate occasional outbreaks. And also they have to have systems and structures to assure that they never get it in. Now, there's been some estimates about the costs of foot-and-mouth disease, and annual impacts in endemic regions, those regions where they kind of always have it present, they can't eradicate, they may be vaccinated. It's been ranging between 6.5 to 21 billion. Billion, that's like 10 zeros after the one, right? So huge amount of money. And even in countries that are free, like Cyprus, you can have losses really high also at times, up to 1.5 billion. But that's really very much less than in the endemic situation. Now, these estimates here that were provided here in this review of the cost of foot-and-mouth disease did not include all the cost that foot-and-mouth disease incur on a country or a region, because they cannot export their products or they're prohibited. Like South America, they cannot export any fresh meat to Europe because of foot-and-mouth disease situation, those kind of situations. There also impacts on cheeses and milks and so on. Now, this was the World Health Organization a year ago. And here you can see how you can have countries that are free, recognized free from foot-and-mouth disease without vaccination. That's the dark green. You can see really the northern parts of the globe, they're free. And then we have some countries that are recognized as free, but they're still carrying out some form of vaccination. Those are the yellow, those light green zones. And then we have some countries here where we have a suspension of foot-and-mouth free status. In April last year, 2025, Hungary and Slovakia, they had lost their free status. There was one herd that became 10 herds in the region between Hungary and Slovakia that had foot-and-mouth disease. And then they had the suspension of the free status. And then you can see all of the other areas of the world here, all of Africa and Southeast Asia, they don't have a status of foot-and-mouth disease. The foot-and-mouth disease is found there. So that's a year ago. Now let's go to the next picture here. This is today. Yes, you see the little red dot down there? Yep, the Cyprus. Yes, unfortunately, it's not free currently. But what I want to show you with this map here also is that Hungary and Slovakia, a year ago, they had this outbreak. They're free again. They managed to control it, and they are now officially free again, which shows that an outbreak of foot-and-mouth disease is not just the end. Now there's no way forward. Countries have repeatedly over and over again in the free zones managed to show, yes, we can get rid of it. When it comes to this virus, foot-and-mouth disease, it has what we call many serotypes. Or just call them species or races, whatever. So you see all of these serotypes here, OAC, Asia1, SAT1, SAT2, SAT3. And you most likely have heard that you have SAT1 right now in Greece. Cyprus. So the thing about this is that these different types, there's not just one vaccine that could be good for all foot-and-mouth disease viruses. Every single vaccine has to be developed for the specific types. And there's very many of them. And that's why we very quickly, when we have an outbreak, we need to determine what's the type in order to say, how can we now get our defense ready? Now, and there's very many countries where we have what we call endemic foot-and-mouth disease. And this is really, endemic means that it's just always present there. You haven't been able to eradicate it. And what they've seen, it creates substantial trade barriers to the international market. And of course, many of these countries where they have FMD endemically, they're not the richest countries, so they can't really afford to eradicate it. And what they see also in these endemic countries, you have cyclic outbreaks. They keep coming back over time, and sometimes it's an acute outbreak, and sometimes it's just subclinical and not so serious, but it's continuous cyclical outbreaks. So it's not like it's not going to disappear on its own. And what they've seen is in countries where they don't have good control over the foot-and-mouth disease, they're suffering both from these direct impacts of the disease, include the food security and all the costs of the preventive and sanitary measure, but also from these trade restrictions. Now, I found this assessment that was done by WHO about the assessment of the spread in the coming 3 months. And this was just done right before the outbreak in Cyprus. And what the WHO concluded was that the SAT1 type of foot-and-mouth disease is very likely to infect livestock in one or more currently unaffected countries in the next 3 months. So they know it's really that the likelihood of war against foot-and-mouth disease was very high. They also concluded in their risk assessment that informal animal movement is the pathway most likely to be responsible for this spread. That means that this is not documented movement. This could be sheep and goats grazing across areas, or people are buying and selling without respecting all of the regulations. And they also concluded that really these informal movements specifically a lot of time take place in the small ruminant sector. And this is a huge threat because these small ruminants are many times subclinically affected by foot-and-mouth disease. That means that they've been infected, but they're not showing any signs. That's a bit like during the pandemic, Corona. Children, they could be infected. They didn't show any signs. They were perfectly healthy. But if the children went into the older elderly homes, a lot of the old people could die because they were highly susceptible. So this subclinical infection is very often seen in the small ruminants. The WHO also concluded that weak veterinary service and lack of SAT1 vaccine could also contribute to a high likelihood of spread. But I know right now you have a lot of SAT1 vaccine in Cyprus. That's good news. When we're looking at the clinical signs then of foot-and-mouth disease, what does it really look like? Well, they call it the incubation period, the time between an animal has been exposed to the time she's starting to show sickness. It's usually between 3 to 8 days, but it can be up to 3 weeks. And what they also seen that you only need a few viruses to make an animal sick. So not a huge dose. And in the beginning, you usually see that the animals, they lose their appetite. You many times see a very sudden drop in milk production. You can also see a high fever. And here are some pictures, also what you will also many times see. It's foot-and-mouth disease. Usually what it does is creates these vesicles. And these vesicles, they can be found in the mouth, but it can also be found between the hoofs and in other areas. And the animals get a high fever and they usually stop ruminating. And then they start salivating a lot because they got these blisters that really do a lot of pain. And with all of that, they're feeling pretty crummy. So of course the milk production drops. So these are typical signs. And that's why whenever any farmer sees any signs of blisters or sudden lameness in several animals, they need to not only think digital dermatitis or something else, they definitely need to think, could this be foot-and-mouth disease? And here's some more pictures here of the typical clinical symptoms. Yes, so you can imagine this is pretty painful. Painful feet and lots of sores in the mouth. You can't really drink or eat or anything. The animals are feeling really pretty crummy. However, these clinical signs, they do not last forever. Usually, it's around 1 week. And then the animal starts building up an immunity against the foot-and-mouth disease virus. And usually an animal has recovered within 2 weeks. However, there's a big challenge. You can have these animals, even if they've recovered, they will have persistent infection from a few weeks up to several years after the initial infection, which means that you will have long periods of time where the productivity of your animals will go down. You can have abortions in pregnant animals. You see weight loss while they can't eat well and so on. Mastitis becomes more common. And some animals, they develop some endocrine disorders. And a big challenge, of course, for animals on Cyprus is that these animals, they tend to be become more intolerant to heat. So they get more stressed out during hot times of the years. And that has a huge impact on your productivity. And you know that very well, the challenges during heat. Now we get animals that becomes even more susceptible to heat. In the young stock, you can actually see deaths. And that's really because the virus goes in and creates an infection of the heart sac, viral, or the heart tissue. So you can see death because of that. But of course, many of them recover. But again, one of the challenges that these calves or these young animals, these young kids and lambs that recover, they again can become these carriers. These subclinical carriers can walk around the flock and looking perfectly healthy. But you also will see retarded growth of the young animals. So what I really want to stress is what's a really big challenge with this foot-and-mouth disease, and that's why we have such stringent measures. When animals carry the virus without appearing sick, it becomes a huge problem in controlling this disease. Some animals may become infected without showing any, and these animals can be carriers for the virus for very long times. And that has been one of the major challenges for foot-and-mouth disease control, and that's why we have such stringent rules where we actually want to declare whole countries free, because we cannot have these subclinical carriers walking around everywhere and causing other ones to become sick. And one of the big challenges is that we get a lot of these subclinical carriers in the small ruminants. So seemingly healthy small ruminants can be carriers of virus, and they will really hinder the eradication of foot-and-mouth disease. And that's a big challenge, of course, on Cyprus with your big small ruminant population. Now, this is a bit of a diagrammatic picture of the various, how the virus can move around in herds. And if you really like to watch it, you can watch it closer afterwards. You can actually get this whole presentation as PDF from POA. If you just contact them, so you can take a look at it. But what I want you to observe is that we have a continuous cycling of the virus in the whole animal population. And there in the middle, you see this C here for carrier. These are the carriers here that will keep reinfecting the group. So here, it's very hard once you have it inside your herd to really get rid of it. And that's one of the reasons why we today have complete stamping out of a herd once they found a positive one, because it would just keep cycling and cycling and cycling inside the herd. You have to get rid of those carriers. Now, in clinical foot-and-mouth disease, how does one animal then spread the virus to others? Well, there's lots of ways here. She can actually exhale the foot-and-mouth disease virus into the air in like aerosols. Aerosols is when the virus sits on small water droplets in the air. It can come from fluid from the vesicles, of course, those big blisters, and then with the saliva. It can also be excreted in the milk. And of course, that's one of the reasons why we have very stringent measures imposed on milk when we have a foot-and-mouth disease outbreak. It can also come out in urine and feces. And then ultimately it can come out in animal products, like in meat products and so on. So that's why when countries have foot-and-mouth disease in their animal population, they cannot export fresh meat to countries that are officially free of foot-and-mouth disease. So you can see this cow, she can spread this virus just about every single way possible. And that's one of the challenges with control also. If you have this animal inside the farm, it's very hard here to isolate and control her, right? So, of course, what happens then when you get infected, as I mentioned, you only need a few viruses to get infected. Well, you can get sick and you can then recover and everything fine. You could possibly die, or you can become what we call the carriers, the ones, that are really causing all the trouble with foot-and-mouth disease. Now, you may wonder about this airborne transmission. There's been a lot of studies done on airborne transmission, and it has been shown that it can actually occur. Foot-and-mouth disease can actually spread through the air. during the millennium there in the United Kingdom, they had a huge outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the United Kingdom. And they actually were able to see that some farms actually got infected through foot and mouth disease traveling through the air. But what I like to stress that it's possible, but it's considered a low probability event. It usually doesn't happen that way. It's very unusual. Cannot be excluded, but it's unusual. Now, so this foot and mouth disease virus is then excreted from the cow through every single channel possible, or the lamb, or the sheep, or the goat, right? Or the pig, for that matter, too. And then we have another big challenge with the foot and mouth disease virus here. Here I've written out how long it survives in certain environment. It can survive about 14 days just in dirt in the shed, but up to 40 days in feces. It can survive up to a month in manure on the pastures, over 2 months on manure in the winter times, over 15 weeks in feed, 5 to 6 weeks in urine, over 4 months in hay, over a month on cattle hair, over 100 days in wastewater, days and months in cheese, and over 6 months even in frozen fresh meat. So you can see that this virus here, not only does it can it be excreted through all of the orifices of the cow, it can also survive for quite a long time on the farm. So once you have eradicated, let's say you have an outbreak on a farm, you kill off all the animals, and then you have to go through a long time before you can repopulate it, because the foot and mouth disease might be hanging around. But there's some good things about the foot and mouth disease virus, if there's anything good. You can quite easily destroy them with good disinfection. So there's a lot of good disinfection procedures you can use. And you most likely already been introduced to quite many of these. Many of these acid-based disinfectants are working quite well. Another good news for you, it dies at pasteurization. So when you're creating halloumi cheese and that halloumi is heated up in that brine to over 90 degrees for quite some time, the foot and mouth disease virus dies. And it also dies at pH under 6, so any kind of cheese where the pH drops quite rapidly. You can also make it die off with UV light, gamma radiation, and X-rays and so on. So there are ways to destroy it, and that's really good, because when we can have ways to make sure we can, after we've cleaned off the tires, we can disinfect the tires so that there's no foot and mouth disease rolling onto your farm. What about treatments of foot and mouth disease? Well, it's a virus, and as you know, with viruses, there are no real treatment for viruses. Just like during the pandemic, we had no treatment for coronavirus. So here we're just trying to alleviate the stress. So let's say we have a country where they have foot and mouth disease endemically. There they simply try to help out the animals as much as possible. They try to help them with drinking so they don't lose too much water, and good palatable soft food so they can eat that. You can maybe use some local administration for antiseptics on the so on. But there's really not a lot of really good treatments. You can try to lessen the wounds for the animals, really. And during a foot and mouth disease outbreaks, it's also, of course, really important not only look at how can you treat the blisters, but also what can you do for the animals during these outbreaks. And here it comes back really to basic husbandry. And I was talking a lot about this last year with a group of farmers from the United Arab Emirates, because they had a large outbreak of foot and mouth disease on some of their dairies. And they were saying, what can we do to help these animals out? And again, it goes down to the basics. You reduce stressors, you improve the palatability of feeds, you reduce mycotoxin stress, you reevaluate your vaccination program, and that was a big challenge in the United Arab Emirates, because the vaccine that was available was not working well towards the strain they had there. And the farmers were really, of course, very frustrated as well. But again, supportive treatment and treatment during the disease is all about supportive treatments, really. Now, we're coming to something that's much more important for you as a farmer. How do you prevent foot-and-mouth disease from entering your farm? And here I got some really good news. You can do a lot. As I mentioned before, the likelihood of wind spread and air spread can happen, but it's really, really low. And now I come in to talk a lot about something that you most likely heard about before, but has now become much more important reality for you all, biosecurity. What about vaccinations? Well, vaccinations, they are really important in what I call in those areas are considered endemic areas, and even in buffer regions. Right now, you are using vaccinations in your control of foot-and-mouth disease. They are really important to reduce the clinical impact of foot-and-mouth and also, but these vaccinations are very costly and they can't really prevent outbreaks. But also in certain areas of the world, we are using buffer vaccination, especially towards the European Union. We have buffer regions in Turkey where European Union is actually paying Turkey to vaccinate all of the animals to prevent exposure of the European stock. Countries such as, yes, Cyprus, but also Bulgaria and Greece. So these buffer regions just reduce the spread of foot-and-mouth disease by not having huge, very extreme outbreaks. But as you've seen, as you've experienced, they're not complete control again. And as I mentioned before, foot-and-mouth disease vaccines are challenged by frequent mutation of the viruses. And also, if you vaccinate against one strain, like a SAT4, you don't have any protection against the SAT1. So therefore, there's no cross-productivity. And foot-and-mouth disease, just a bit like the coronas, frequent mutations and a lot of variability. And we quickly get outbreaks of new strains. So like with vaccines, we're always kind of running after the outbreak. It's a bit like we're always trying to stop the fire once it has started. We're not really preventing fires with the vaccination as much because they're always changing. And another challenge with vaccinations as a strategy to reduce the impact of foot-and-mouth disease is that vaccinated animals can really become persistent carriers too. As you see here at the bottom here, these vaccinated animals can actually become carriers and maintain infections. So you're not getting rid of it. And they're even harder to find these persistent carriers because the vaccination are covering up a bit more of the clinical effects. So that's one of the reasons why vaccinations many times are not approved in these 3 areas, because the vaccines are covering up potential outbreaks. So now, what can you do then? Well, biosecurity. And I know you've heard many of it about biosecurity, and you may be thinking about this cow going through the shower and everything clean and so on, but biosecurity is so much more. And biosecurity is really the baseline of health in your flock. And this is not just against foot-and-mouth disease. It says every single disease-causing agent that can come across your farm doors. It could be mastitis pathogens, it could be lameness, you name it. It could be any type of challenge. And when we talk about biosecurity, which I sometimes like to rather refer to as herd protection, we have what we call external protection, and we have internal protection. And for foot-and-mouth disease right now for you, the external protection is the critical part. This is everything you can do to prevent a pathogen, a disease-causing agent to come into your farm. Now, once you have it inside the farm, of course, then you want to limit the spread, and then that becomes more internal biosecurity. But I won't really talk a lot more about that today. If you're really interested, we can definitely follow up on this with more webinars and so on. But the external biosecurity, prevent it from coming into your farm. Now, I kind of drew up this diagram here of a farm. This is just a dairy farm, just to show how much things are flowing around on the farm. The feed is going, we have pregnant animals, we have maternity pens, we have young stock, we have feed coming in, we have animals' diets, possibly carcasses and so on. So there's, as you can see, there's a lot of flows here, a lot of arrows, and it's not only animals. You can see there's even some rodents here that can prevent some threats to you, and we have people walking around everywhere. So inside a farm, it's really hard to control the flow of pathogens around, and that's why the external biosecurity is so important. And the external biosecurity here in this picture here is this black line around the farm. This is the why if you can prevent anything coming inside this black line, have control over that, then you have so much more control. So you can note in this picture, for example, the parking lot for visitors or veterinarians or anyone else coming onto your farm should be outside your farm premises. They should never drive inside your farm. You can also see that there's a quarantine there, and it's placed outside the farm premises. If for some reason you need to buy an animal, you can put it outside the farm, and then you can do a lot of testing and keep it there and make sure it's really clean and healthy before you bring it into the farm. Another thing that's found outside the farm here, as you notice, is the carcass storage. Maybe you have a lot of animals dying, and then they go and get hauled off for carcass rendering or similar. Again, those trucks should never drive inside your farm. So what's really important for you is to be able to see, how can I prevent anything from coming inside this black line? And if they come in, how do they come in? You can see here at the top in those gray boxes there, the hygiene lock. This is when visitors come into your farm that they can put on clean coveralls and boots and everything before they enter the farm. And also the truck loading area here, if they really need to come into your farm, that you have control over that. So when we're looking at external biosecurity principles, we sometimes refer to areas as being clean and dirty. It's not that clean, not really clean, but it's just the clean areas is anything within your farm. It's your animals, it's your workers. That's the clean area, the farm animals. Anything outside that you don't have control of are considered dirty. They may not be dirty, but they're considered dirty. And then what you really need to do is that you have anything you're bringing from the dirty areas over into the clean areas, into your farm, you have preventive measures. And that's really very important in the external biosecurity. And of course, the biggest threat coming into your farm is going to always be the live animals. And purchasing live animals and putting it directly into your farm is really what we call the Trojan horse. And you know the story of the Trojan horse, how it came in full with soldiers and invaded the city of Troy. They opened the door for the Trojan horse. They said, come on in. They opened the big doors and they brought in the horse full of soldiers inside to destroy the city. And so it can be with live animals. You bring in these livestock, these replacement heifers, or these young stock you want to have expand your herd, and you're bringing them in with a lot of diseases. You could even bring them in with foot and mouth disease. So live animal imports or live animals going into your farm is the biggest #1 challenge. And that's why I always say a closed herd, which means that you're not recruiting any animals from outside your own farm. It's all you're recruiting your future lactating herd from your own young stock, right? From your heifers or your young ewes and so on. And what's really, if you ever think about buying in a live animal, you never purchase lactating animals that directly have to go into the milking parlor. That's really kind of asking for it, asking for trouble. So if you really need to purchase live animals, then you really need to have very stringent measures. You need to check where the animals are coming from. You might even want to test them before they are sent off from the farm, before you even buy them. You said, I'd like to take some samples from these animals and test them for various things. Whatever you do, if you introduce new animals, don't exchange bulls between herds or reproductive rams and so on. That's very dangerous. And if you are bringing in new animals, even animals that have been out somewhere else, you really need to have a quarantine. And that's, so you see, this is not only about foot and mouth disease, this is about every single pathogen. Common grounds I don't know to what extent. I haven't seen a lot of common grounds, but I'm sure you have some grazing grounds again in Cyprus in various places. And these can also be high risk for the herd because they might come into contact with animals of other herds that you don't have control over. And of course, remember that foot and mouth disease can survive for a very long time on pastures and in feces for months. So there again, where the animals are grazing can become a huge challenge. And then, of course, transports is not one of those really high-risk things that goes on. When you're transporting animals, they get super stressed out. And if you also start saying, well, we're going to transport animals from various farms together, that's again a bit like asking for it. So you need to be very careful with transports. If you're bringing animals in, make sure there's no other animals going to other farms on the same transport. Avoid sharing trailers and other machinery. And if they are coming onto your farm, make sure they don't drive into your farm. Make sure they offload outside what we call the farm perimeter so that those wheels don't come driving in, because those wheels, as you remember, foot and mouth disease can hang on those too. And dead stock, again, as you saw in that picture, in that diagram, dead stock should really be disposed of outside the farm perimeters. And these can really be a high risk. Maybe not as much a high risk to your farm animals, but they can contaminate wildlife and they can then be a huge risk to other farmers. And then if other cars and so on drive by and they pick it up on the wheels, again, we have a huge risk here with spread of virus through dead stock. And that's been a huge challenge in foot and mouth disease control. So many times in foot and mouth disease, when we've killed off all the animals, we don't move them. We make a huge pit, we bury them or burn them or compost them or similar, because it can be a super high risk in transporting these dead stock. Now, disinfection and control of entry is absolutely very important. And this is something we've learned over decades and centuries, how important it is for trucks coming into a farm. Now, this is a farm in Turkey, and they are quite aware of the risk of foot and mouth disease. So every time a truck goes into their farm, they will run through this disinfection bath with a lot of citric acid, and the whole truck will also be hosed off. They put this whole mechanism. And when I was going through into that farm, I had to go through a cabinet and get sprayed by something. I don't know what it was, but they realized we can't afford to have any virus coming along with Cat Berge onto this farm. So visitor control is really also a very important part of your external biosecurity. Not as important if you're bringing in live animals or anything like that, but visitors can indeed bring on a lot of virus onto the farms. And as you remember, you could have these foot and mouth disease virus survive months in dirt and so on. So what's really important, if visitors need to come to your farm, especially right now, they should not have to be into a previous farm on that same day. They should have had a shower and have absolutely new clean clothes before they even come to your farm. And when they come to the farm, you should provide them with protective clothing. Protective clothing can be like these white clothing here in the pictures, but they can also be just clean coveralls they have on the farm, lots of clean boots. And you say to your farmer, if you want to walk onto, you say to the visitors, you want to walk onto my farm, you have to have this gearing, otherwise you can't come in. These visitors, as I mentioned before in that picture, they should be parking outside the farm perimeters. And you have maybe also some agriculture contractors that are coming in. They may be working in fields, they may be working in equipment, they may have to restore your milking machines and so on. If they are rolling into your farm, make sure they go through a disinfection bath before and after. Now, just the other month, I published a paper on looking at what is the need that the visitors have not been 24 hours on a farm before they come to your farm. And that review of all of the risk, especially in regard to foot and mouth disease, we noticed that the 24-hour period is not as important as just that they have taken a shower and have new clean clothes. Now, animal health care providers are really a much bigger challenge than occasional visitors, because you can see here I am at the bottom of this picture here. I'm working directly with animals and also with sick animals. So animal care providers like foot trimmers, shearers, or veterinarians are really much higher risk than any other occasional visitor because they come in direct contact with the animals. So do make sure that any veterinarian or health professional coming onto your farm, that they have clean clothes and clean boots on. And if you want to really make sure that they have that, the best way is that you have clean boots and coveralls available for your healthcare providers. So you say, you want to walk into my farm? Here's your boots. What size do you have? 42, here you go. So that you don't give that responsibility and rely on somebody else's cleanliness. Because the healthcare providers are the ones that are most closely in contact with the animals. So they are the highest risks. And of course, what's really important, again, here's some pictures of how it can look when you come in. Entrance procedures and hygiene logs are very important. And this is not only for the veterinarians and nutritionists and sales people that are coming onto the farm. This is also your workers. Every single worker needs to go through this every day. Where have they been? Let's see that they went to a place on a market and they met a lot of other farmers on the market and they walked around there with their boots. And then their boots came in contact with some virus that was found from some other farmers' boots there. So you need to make sure that no shoe wear or no clothes that are used outside the farm are ever brought in close contact with your animals on your farm. So just put in place one of these systems and then you can, to a much larger extent, eliminate that risk. Because I know right now there's a lot of gathering and discussions among farmers about the possible threats of foot and mouth disease. And unfortunately, coming a lot of farmers in close contact with each other, and that could be a potential risk. Also, good way to wash the hands. Hands are always in contact directly with animals. And here's a picture of boots. Now, when the shit wants to travel, it hangs onto the boots. So if you want to make sure that you have really no risk from boots coming out, make sure that the boots are cleaned every end of the day, always, and also disinfected. And then I would really like to have them hanging upside down at the end of the day so that you as a farm manager can expect that there are no unnecessary shit traveling around on the boots. Again, simple procedures. This is not rocket science, but this can make a difference. Because if you go with those boots to the very young calves that have a very poor immunity, they may be even more sensitive than an adult dairy cow or an adult ewe. And hand washing. Again, so many times when I come out to farms, I find hand washing facilities that are definitely looking like here, like to the left. Make sure that it's really easy to clean your hands many times a day. These hands are traveling between animals all day long. Now, I've been working a lot with biosecurity for now many decades, and also with the University of Ghent. And the University of Ghent have developed a whole program for assessing biosecurity on farms. And here you can actually go in and see, how am I doing in my biosecurity? What am I missing? What's my highest risks? And the biocheck is really what this biosecurity scoring system that the University of Ghent has developed. And they have a special biocheck for small ruminant dairy and small ruminant meat. And they also have for large dairies and they have for all categories, but they have biosecurity scoring for all types of dairy farms. And when you're using these kind of scoring systems, you can then see, here you can see the external biosecurity to the left here, and the internal biosecurity. And then you can see how you're doing. If you get 100 is optimal score, like this farm here has 100 on the external biosecurity, it means that they're a closed herd. They're not buying in any animals and so on. But you can see that they're missing some biosecurity on some other parameters. And you can see in the internal biosecurity, they're scoring really low. And that's why I'm saying it's so hard to have a good biosecurity system inside the farm because there's so much flow of movement. So this might be of interest for you to look into. Now, a few notes, because I know there's been a lot of questions about the vaccinations and so on. Georg is currently doing some really important vaccinations here to reduce the spread of foot-and-mouth disease in the ring areas. What's really important also is you need to make sure that the vaccine works as well as possible. And many times the vaccine is working, but the animals are not. So in order to make sure that your vaccine, when you're vaccinating the animals, they're working as well as possible, you need to ensure that there's really low stress levels in the herds, as low as possible. And not too much shuffling, not too much movement. You don't regroup the animals and then start vaccinating all at the same time a few days later. So try to reduce all stress levels as much as possible. And what's also super important is that you really have optimum diet for all stages of productions that can boost immunity. And when it comes to boosting immunity, it's really important that you are using organic microminerals. That has been shown to have really can optimize vaccination response. And there's also a product that is available that has been shown to help out many animals that when they're vaccinated against foot-and-mouth disease, and that's Sangrovit. So that's something you may want to look into, and POA can advise you. So shortly in conclusions there, what I would like to say. Yes, you do need to know as much as possible. Let's see, I need to go to the next slide here. You need to cooperate with authorities to eliminate this disease. Otherwise, you just suffer lifelong consequences. Yes, it's not fun at all. It's terrible, I know. But the alternative is even worse. So I can assure you the authorities, they know what they're doing. We have over 100 years of experience in fighting foot-and-mouth disease, and this is really what needs to be done, because living with foot-and-mouth disease is no country wants that on a long-term basis. And for that, it's really important to realize that if you have clinical healthy animals in a herd where they've diagnosed foot-and-mouth disease, that could be one of those chronic subclinical carriers that look healthy, but they can spread disease. And that's the reason why, unfortunately, we need to kill off the whole herd. No fun. If there had been a better solution, I'm sure we would have found it. But currently, there are no way, because this virus is very sneaky. And unfortunately, vaccines, they're not the future solutions. They can just milden the bad negative impact, but they're not a good alternative at all. So I encourage you to know the early signs of FMD. If you see them, do not try to hide them. Notify the authorities. And also what's really important is if you don't have it right now, there's no signs, whatever you do, you can take a lot of biosecurity measures to protect your herd. You can do a lot to prevent it walking into your herd. And also you need to ensure that you're not a possible vector for foot-and-mouth disease. When you're going around farms or on markets or meeting farmers in other places, that you're not transmitting anything around. And yes, I know it's a tough time, but remember Hungary and Slovakia a year ago, they also had a huge outbreak. It spread from one farm to over 10 farms, and it was over 100,000, there were over 10,000 dairy cows in one farm, and they had to all get eradicated and everything. And it was terrible, but they've recovered their foot-and-mouth disease status, and now it's much better. Now you may ask, well, how do I know we're not getting it next year again? Well, I can't guarantee you're not going to get it next year, but the likelihood is going to be a lot smaller, because all of farmers, the whole farming community in Cyprus will have learned so much from this outbreak about how to limit the spread and what precautions to take. So it's very unlikely it will happen again just next year or within 2 years. And look at it, you've stayed over decades without foot-and-mouth disease. And the same for Greece and Bulgaria. It's not like suddenly, just because the virus managed to walk across the border one time, it's going to do it on a yearly basis. So just say, okay, this was a one-time incident. Now we're going to build this defense against foot and mouth disease even higher to prevent it from happening again. And then hopefully it will. And ultimately, in this fight against foot and mouth disease, you will raise your resistance against all types of diseases. So in a very long run, it will help you to get an even higher animal health status. So with that, I'd like to round up this short webinar. You can contact me there. You can see if you speak English or so. You have my email and telephone number. Otherwise, I recommend that you just contact POA, or you can also go through Vettaky, because I've been working a lot with POA and Vettaky in Cyprus over the last few years. Thank you.